They had warned me about the swamps, the murky waters stretching like a silent, unbroken secret across the Louisiana landscape. Stories drifted through the town of Manchac like the wind over the bayous, of strange lights and eerie voices, and of her. The woman of Manchac Swamp, they said, had cursed this place before she took her last breath, leaving a shadow that clung to the land, deep and thick as the mist that rose from the bogs. I was never one to be superstitious, yet that night, standing at the edge of the swamp, the stories clawed at my mind, persistent and sharp. The evening had descended early, casting long fingers of shade over the water. Towering cypress trees stretched their limbs toward me, and beneath them the water was still. It looked like polished black glass, too calm, as if waiting for something to disturb its silence. My hands were heavy at my sides, and I held my breath as I took a cautious step forward. The damp earth beneath me gave a faint, reluctant shift. I could feel the decay of leaves and years beneath my feet, as if I'd walked right into the history of the swamp itself. The quiet was thick around me, pressing in with a sense of knowing, a strange kind of attention that prickled the edges of my awareness. Locals called her the woman of the swamp, a figure who seemed more myth than memory. Yet, everyone knew the tale passed down as fact rather than folklore. They said she was a healer, once, skilled in plants and herbs, able to mend bones and cure fevers when no one else could. People whispered that her practices held an unnatural edge, and that she had lived alone by choice. Over time, suspicion grew into fear, and fear into hatred, until one day she vanished. The townspeople had discovered her lifeless form later, her last words spoken to the earth itself. A curse, some claimed, that summoned the swamp to her will. I told myself I'd come for adventure, for the thrill of discovering something beyond the ordinary, to see if the swamp would share its secrets with me. Yet now, standing there, I couldn't shake the strange weight pressing into my chest, as though the swamp itself was exhaling toward me, waiting to speak. It was then that the air shifted, an almost imperceptible change, but I felt it. The shadows around me thickened, deepened, and within them, something seemed to stir, watching. The silence turned almost tangible, pressing in around my ears, heavy and relentless. I took another step forward, drawn by an urge I couldn't quite name, as if something in the distance was calling out, waiting to be found. Ahead, where the trees parted slightly, the water stretched wider, forming a small, still pool. And for a moment I thought I caught sight of something, a flicker like movement but quick, too fast to be anything solid. My pulse quickened, an involuntary reaction, as I took another step closer, and then another. Then, just as I neared the edge, I heard it. A sound, soft yet distinct, somewhere between a sigh and a murmur, just barely there, like the earth itself was shifting, echoing a memory it could not forget. It was then I understood why they called it a curse, and why no one returned alone from these waters after dark. The sound lingered in my ears, faint and insistent, as though it had somehow pressed itself into the night air. I paused, trying to steady myself, but the noise was too peculiar to ignore. A rhythm, almost like breathing, coming from somewhere within the swamp. Each sound seemed to ripple outward, mingling with the murmurs of unseen creatures and the soft rustle of leaves, until it was impossible to tell where one ended and another began. I kept walking, drawn further into the depths of the swamp, my footsteps tentative, each one pulling me into a darkness that felt more alive with every step. The stories had warned about the swamp's hold on people, about how it seemed to trap them in its depths. making them forget which way they'd come. I shook off the thought, but still the sensation grew, as though the swamp were slowly closing in around me, tugging me forward with an insistent pull. Around me, the trees loomed larger, their gnarled roots curling up from the ground in grotesque shapes that twisted and spiraled toward the sky. Moss hung from their branches, thick and heavy, as though even the trees themselves were bound by the weight of the swamp's secrets. Beneath the canopy, light was sparse, swallowed by the shadows, and my breath fogged the cool, damp air as I went deeper still. Then, without warning, my foot sank into the soft earth, and I stumbled forward, catching myself against the trunk of a tree. My fingers pressed into the rough bark, and as I looked down, I saw something peculiar. Small indentations in the mud, faint but unmistakable, as if someone had walked this same path before me. The prints were shallow, half buried by leaves and time, yet they held a strange familiarity that sent a chill through me. It was as if I were following in footsteps left by someone who hadn't intended to return. I paused, studying the ground, the prints weaving a path that led further into the swamp. Their edges softened, but unmistakably human. But even as I looked closer, something about them felt wrong. Too far apart, as though the person who'd left them had been moving with an unnatural haste, almost a desperation. An uncomfortable feeling crept into my mind, but I forced it away, reminding myself that I'd come here by choice, that I could leave whenever I wanted. Yet the swamp seemed to murmur otherwise, its shadows pressing in closer, as if to remind me that I was no longer the one in control. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound came again, a soft rhythm that pulsed through the air, its source hidden within the dense layers of moss and shadow. I moved forward, the prints leading me deeper into a thicket of trees where the air grew denser, the ground softer, almost spongy beneath my feet. The deeper I went, the more I felt the weight of the swamp settle over me, pressing down, as though it knew my intentions, my doubts. I thought about the stories I'd heard, of those who had wandered too deep into the swamp and never returned. I had dismissed them as folklore, tales meant to scare off those who were too curious, but now the lines between truth and legend blurred before me, thick as the mist rising from the water. Then, as I took another step, the sound shifted, growing sharper, closer, until it was unmistakable. A voice, just a few feet ahead, whispering my name. I froze, the world narrowing around me, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the shadows, watching me with a gaze that felt ancient and knowing, as though it had been waiting all along. And then, before I could call out or even move, the figure faded back into the shadows, leaving only the stillness of the swamp and the relentless rhythm of its breath. The figure's presence lingered in the air long after it had vanished. I felt its gaze etched onto the night, a shadow trailing behind me, watching each step as I ventured deeper. My rational mind fought to make sense of what I'd seen, to believe it had been nothing more than a trick of the fog or the effect of a long day's journey. But the swamp had a way of unearthing doubts, of nudging them to life until they were impossible to ignore. My steps slowed, each one measured and cautious, as though I were moving within a dream where the ground beneath me shifted with every touch. The silence thickened around me, not empty, but dense, layered with something that felt like memory or purpose. The swamp had seen things, I realized, moments and secrets that it guarded with the jealous fervor of an old storyteller, reluctant to reveal its treasures to an outsider. The stillness drew me in, pulling me to the edge of a large, dark pool that lay ahead, its surface unmoving, untouched by even the faintest breath of wind. The water seemed to absorb all light, transforming it into a deep, hollow darkness that gave nothing back. As I looked closer, I thought I saw faint shapes beneath the surface, shadows twisting and turning, just beyond the reach of sight, as if something were lying in wait beneath. I told myself it was only my imagination, that the swamp was playing its tricks on me, yet a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something down there knew I was watching. Something old, patient, and endless. The stories of the woman came back to me in a rush, her final words spoken to the waters, her spirit left to linger, seeking those who would dare to trespass. I remembered the warning. If you heard her voice, you would be pulled under, claimed by the muck and the roots, never to return. Just then, a faint sound rippled across the surface. A gentle splash, too quiet to be any creature I knew. My gaze fixed on the pool, drawn to the place where the sound had come from, as if compelled by an invisible thread. The darkness seemed to pulse, its depths stretching upward, reaching out, until I felt that if I didn't turn away, I might lose myself within it. But before I could step back, I heard it again. A voice, soft and distant, like a breeze weaving through the trees. This time it didn't call my name, but I sensed it all the same, echoing from somewhere I couldn't quite place. The voice carried a note of sadness, a lament that hung in the air, wrapping itself around the night, entangled in the shadows of the trees. And then, as I strained to listen, I realized it wasn't the swamp itself, but something within me, answering back. "Are you lost?" the voice asked, low and melodic, drifting through the darkness like a forgotten tune. I wanted to respond, to call out, but something in me resisted, held back by an instinct that urged me to remain silent. I glanced around, half expecting to see the figure again, hidden in the thicket of trees, but all I saw was the dark, endless stretch of swamp. The quiet deepened, and with it, a sense of unease crept over me, like a shadow spreading over the water. I took a step back, my feet finding firmer ground, but as I did, the voice grew stronger, clearer, as though it had been waiting for me to move. "You don't belong here," it said, a faint edge of warning in its tone, not hostile, but heavy, like an old truth resurfacing. I froze, feeling the weight of those words press into my mind, and for the first time, a strange clarity washed over me. I was not supposed to be here. This place was not meant for the living, not meant for the curious. It was a sanctuary of the forgotten, of things that refused to stay buried. And here I was, an intruder, uninvited, drawn to a mystery I didn't fully understand. With each passing moment, the darkness around me thickened, and the swamp felt as if it were closing in, pulling me closer to its heart. I forced myself to turn, to look back toward the way I'd come, but the path was shrouded, swallowed by a fog that seemed to pulse, alive and aware. My steps faltered, but the urge to leave pulled at me, stronger now, insistent, as though the very earth were whispering its warnings into my bones. But as I turned to leave, a part of me couldn't help but look back, drawn to that pool one last time. And there, just for a moment, I thought I saw her. A faint figure standing at the edge of the water, her form blurred, almost translucent, watching me with a look that held neither malice nor mercy, but a deep, endless sorrow. And then she was gone, leaving only the quiet of the swamp and the lingering echo of her voice, a whisper woven into the night. I walked quickly, my feet sinking into the damp ground, the mud pulling at my steps as though trying to hold me back. The farther I went, the more I felt the swamp itself watching, observing me with a quiet, enduring patience. It was the patience of a place that had seen countless lives drift in and out, each one leaving a mark, a whisper, that lingered long after they were gone. I reached the narrow trail that wound through the thickening trees and felt a brief surge of relief. Yet, the moment I stepped onto it, I became aware of a new sound, a faint, rhythmic rustling, the kind that might accompany a small creature scuttling through the underbrush. But this sound was steady, purposeful, almost as though it were following my every step. I paused, listening, and for a heartbeat, the swamp fell silent, as if waiting, listening with me. Then, from somewhere behind, the sound resumed, closer this time. I could feel my pulse in my throat, each beat loud, an unwelcome reminder of how alone I was. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure from before, but there was nothing. Only the endless tangle of trees and shadows, and the silence that seemed to thicken around me, pressing in like an unseen presence. I kept moving, picking up my pace, trying to focus on the path ahead. But that sound continued, persistent and unhurried, trailing behind me like a shadow I couldn't shake. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, perhaps an animal, maybe even my own footsteps echoing in some strange way. But a part of me knew better. I wasn't alone. Something or someone was following. The trees thickened around me, their branches twisting together overhead, blocking out what little light remained. The air felt heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. It was as if the swamp had swallowed the light entirely, drawing me deeper into its embrace, into a world that existed beyond the reach of day or night, a place where time itself seemed to hold its breath. As I walked, I found myself thinking of the stories I'd heard, the tales of the woman who had cursed this place, of her voice luring people into the darkness, never to return. They said she had been a healer once, a woman of knowledge, before the townspeople turned against her. I tried to remember more of the details, but the stories were vague, fragmented, passed down in whispers that grew fainter with each retelling. And yet, standing here, surrounded by the shadows of the swamp, those stories felt more real than anything I'd ever known. I could almost imagine her, walking these very paths, her spirit lingering in the places where the living dared not tread. It was as though the swamp itself bore her memory, each tree and stone a silent witness to her fate, her sorrow woven into the roots and the water, a part of the land itself. I stopped suddenly, realizing that the rustling sound had ceased. The silence was complete, absolute, a kind of quiet that seemed to press down on me, heavy and suffocating. I stood there, waiting, my eyes straining against the darkness, my senses heightened, alert to the slightest movement. But there was nothing, only the silence, stretching on, endless and unnerving. I turned, ready to continue, but froze as a figure emerged from the shadows ahead. It was the woman, standing just beyond the reach of my vision, her form blurred, indistinct, as though she were part of the mist itself. She didn't move, didn't speak, but I felt her eyes on me, watching, waiting. My instinct was to run, to turn and flee, but something in her gaze held me in place, rooted to the spot. There was a sadness in her eyes, a depth of sorrow that seemed to transcend time, as though she were carrying the weight of countless lives, each one a thread in the dark tapestry of the swamp. And then, as I looked into her eyes, I understood. She wasn't there to harm me. She was trapped, bound to this place, as much a part of it as the trees and the water. She raised her hand, a slow, deliberate motion, and pointed to something beyond me, into the depths of the swamp. I felt a strange compulsion to follow her gaze, to look into the darkness where she was pointing. But as I turned, the world shifted, the shadows deepened, and the swamp seemed to close in around me, its silence thickening, wrapping around me like a shroud. I blinked, and she was gone, leaving me alone in the darkness, with only the memory of her sorrowful gaze and the echo of her silent warning. I took a step back, my heart pounding, a growing sense of dread settling over me. I knew I should leave, turn back, abandon this place and never return. But something held me there, a lingering question, an unspoken promise that I couldn't ignore. What was she trying to tell me? And why did I feel that the answer was waiting for me, somewhere in the depths of the swamp, hidden in the shadows that stretched on, endless and eternal? The night deepened as I pressed forward, stepping off the narrow trail and into the more tangled, uncharted part of the swamp. Each step became heavier, the ground thick with mud and roots that twisted beneath my feet like hidden traps. My heartbeat settled into an uneasy rhythm, as if syncing with the slow, almost sentient pulse of the land itself. There was something binding about this place, as though the trees and the earth shared some ancient pact, one that I had unwittingly crossed into. The air hung thick, not merely with moisture but with a silence so profound it felt alive. I became aware of the sounds I no longer heard, the chirping of crickets, the occasional splash of unseen creatures in the water, all gone, leaving only the weight of the quiet around me. It was as though the swamp had chosen to hold its breath, watching, waiting, and in its stillness, it seemed to be considering me, deciding if I was worth revealing its secrets to. I wasn't sure why I kept moving forward. A part of me wanted to turn back, to flee from the oppressive shadows and the feeling that something was watching me from just beyond the veil of trees. Yet, another part of me felt pulled, as though I had been called here, summoned by that silent woman whose presence lingered even now, just out of reach. I could almost feel her at my side, her gaze leading me deeper into the unknown. And then I saw it, a faint glow in the distance, barely perceptible through the dense thicket. It wasn't the cold, sterile light of a lamp, nor the warm flicker of a fire. It was something different, something that seemed to pulse with a life of its own, casting faint shadows that danced across the trees, making their gnarled forms shift and sway in ways that defied reason. Drawn to it, I pushed through the underbrush, the branches scratching at my arms, the ground growing wetter and more treacherous with each step. The glow grew brighter, illuminating a small clearing that lay hidden within the swamp, a place untouched by any trail or sign of human presence. In the center of the clearing stood a tree unlike any I had ever seen. A massive cypress, ancient and twisted, its roots sprawling outward in a tangle that seemed to both embrace and entrap the earth around it. The glow was emanating from the base of the tree, a strange, ethereal light that seeped from the ground itself, casting the cypress in a ghostly hue. And there, at the base of the tree, was something carved into the bark, an inscription, faded and worn, but unmistakably deliberate. I knelt down, brushing away the moss and grime, revealing a set of symbols I couldn't decipher, each one carved with a precision that spoke of purpose, of ritual. My fingers traced the rough lines, and as I did, a chill crept over me, not from the air but from within. It was as if the symbols themselves held a power, a memory that the tree had absorbed over countless years, each line a testament to something long buried, something that had once held sway over this land. And then, as my hand moved over the final symbol, I felt it, A surge of cold that shot through my arm, a sharp, piercing sensation that left me gasping. I pulled my hand back, staring at my fingers, half expecting to see them marked by whatever energy had pulsed through the tree. But they were unmarked, save for a faint trembling that I couldn't quite control. I glanced back at the inscription, and in that moment, I felt a presence beside me, a whisper of movement, as though someone were standing just out of sight, watching with silent intent. Slowly, I turned, and there she was, the woman from before, her form barely discernible in the faint glow of the clearing. She stood motionless, her face obscured by shadows, yet her presence was undeniable, filling the space with a quiet that was somehow louder than any sound. She raised her hand, pointing once more, not at the tree but at something beyond it, into the heart of the swamp. It was then that I understood. The tree was a marker, a boundary, a gateway to something hidden within the swamp's depths. And she was the guardian, bound to this place, a sentinel trapped between worlds, her spirit forever tied to the land and the curse that lingered within it. She was showing me the path, leading me deeper into the darkness, urging me to uncover whatever lay buried here, whatever had drawn her here so long ago. I looked into her eyes, searching for some hint of warning, some sign that I should turn back. But her gaze was empty, hollow, filled only with a quiet despair that seemed to echo the sadness of the land itself. She was beyond hope, beyond redemption, and in her gaze, I saw a reflection of my own fate, a journey that would lead me into the heart of the swamp, into the secrets that lay waiting beneath its dark, silent waters. As I took a step forward, she faded, her form dissolving into the shadows, leaving me alone in the clearing with only the faint glow of the tree to guide me. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for whatever lay ahead, and with a final glance at the ancient cypress, I stepped beyond its roots, into the darkness that awaited me. The path beyond the tree was almost indiscernible, overgrown with creeping vines and thick with mud that clung to my boots, pulling me deeper into the mire with each step. The glow from the ancient cypress faded behind me, leaving only the swamp's natural darkness. A darkness so thick it felt like a living thing, pressing in on me, closing me off from the world I'd left behind. My senses sharpened in the absence of light, each rustle of leaves, each faint splash of unseen creatures magnified tenfold. The silence seemed to gather around me, wrapping itself around my mind until it felt almost oppressive. I could feel the weight of the air, humid and unyielding, clinging to my skin, filling my lungs with each shallow breath. It was as if the swamp itself wanted me to turn back, to abandon this path and leave its secrets undisturbed. But something drove me onward, a feeling I couldn't name, a pull that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the earth. It was a compulsion as strong as fear, yet somehow different, a magnetic pull that seemed to resonate with some hidden part of me. The further I ventured, the stronger it became, guiding me forward, step by step, deeper into the heart of the swamp. Then, through the shadows, I glimpsed a shape, something half buried in the mud and reeds, obscured by the dense foliage. I moved closer, my heartbeat quickening as I cleared away the vines, revealing what looked like the remnants of an old, abandoned cabin. Its walls were warped and rotting, the wood darkened with age and covered in a thick layer of moss. One of the windows hung askew, and the door was barely held in place by its rusted hinges, creaking softly in the faint breeze. There was no question in my mind. This was her place. The woman's presence seemed to linger here, woven into the very fibers of the cabin's decaying wood. It was as if she had left a part of herself behind, a fragment of her soul that had never quite faded, clinging to this place like a shadow that refused to die. I hesitated at the doorway, my hand hovering over the broken handle. A faint tremor ran through my fingers, but I forced myself to turn the knob, pushing the door open with a groan that echoed through the empty swamp. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp wood and decay, mixed with something else, something faint and metallic that stirred an inexplicable sense of dread within me. The cabin was small, barely more than a single room, with a few pieces of broken furniture scattered across the floor. The walls were lined with strange symbols, carved into the wood in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate, almost ritualistic. Each line, each curve, seemed to hold a purpose, a meaning that I couldn't decipher but could feel all the same. A sense of unease, of something waiting just beneath the surface, waiting to be seen. In the center of the room was a table, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust, save for one small, clear space where an object lay. A small, tarnished locket, half hidden beneath a crumbling piece of fabric. I picked it up, feeling the cool metal against my skin, and a strange sensation washed over me, a sense of déjà vu so strong it was almost overwhelming. It was as if I had seen this locket before, held it in my hands, though I knew that couldn't be possible. Opening the locket, I found a small, faded photograph inside. A woman's face, her eyes hauntingly familiar, gazing back at me with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. It was her, the woman from the swamp, her likeness captured in the grainy image as though she had been waiting for me, watching me from the shadows all along. As I stared at the photograph, a faint sound echoed through the cabin. A soft, low murmur, like the wind whispering through the trees, but there was no breeze, no movement in the air. The sound grew louder, filling the room, until it was almost a chant, a rhythmic hum that seemed to resonate within my chest, vibrating through my bones. It was a sound of sorrow, of longing, a voice from beyond the veil, reaching out from the depths of the swamp to find me. The murmur grew stronger, more insistent, as if urging me to understand, to remember. And then, in a flash, I saw it, a vision, a glimpse of the swamp as it had been long ago, before the hurricanes, before the curse. I saw her, the woman, standing at the edge of the water, her hands raised to the sky, her face twisted in a mixture of grief and fury as she called upon something ancient and powerful, something that answered her call with a force that shattered the stillness of the swamp, setting it ablaze with a wrath that would never fade. The vision faded as quickly as it had come, leaving me standing in the silence once more, the locket clutched in my hand, my heart pounding in my chest. I understood now, or at least I thought I did. She had been betrayed, abandoned by those who had once promised her loyalty, and in her final moments, she had bound herself to the land, cursing it with her pain, her rage, her unending sorrow. The swamp was her prison, her sanctuary, her revenge, and now I was part of it, bound to her story, her legacy, her curse. I couldn't escape it, couldn't deny the pull that had brought me here, that held me in its grip, refusing to let go. As I turned to leave the cabin, I felt a strange sense of acceptance, a quiet resignation that settled over me like a shroud. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't leave. Not yet. Not until I had seen this through to the end. Until I had uncovered the truth of her curse and the fate that awaited me within the dark heart of the swamp. Emerging from the cabin, I felt the swamp close in around me, as if it were alive, shifting and breathing in rhythm with my own heartbeat. Each step was a reminder of the gravity that held me there, more than simple curiosity or a search for answers. It was as if I had been called, as if I were meant to be here. I retraced my steps along the barely visible path, but the landscape had changed. What had seemed a clear trail minutes before was now obscured by new growth, twisted vines, and patches of slick, wet mud. The air was thick with an unfamiliar fragrance, a sweet, decaying scent that both lured and repelled. It was the kind of smell that seemed to pull memories to the surface, indistinct and formless, hovering at the edge of thought. As I pushed through the undergrowth, I heard it, the faintest sound, distant yet unmistakable, like a voice caught on the edge of a breeze. It wasn't a word or a whisper, but rather a tone, a pitch, a feeling that resonated inside my chest. I stopped, held my breath, and listened. The swamp was quiet, yet the silence was layered, full of unspoken things. And there it was again, unmistakably calling. I couldn't resist it. I let myself follow the sound, one foot in front of the other, each step slower than the last as I waded deeper into the unknown. I soon realized that my path had shifted toward the water's edge, where the trees gave way to an expanse of dark, glassy water. Thin strands of mist hovered above the surface, moving in strange, slow patterns that seemed purposeful, deliberate. The woman's presence felt stronger here, her story tangled in the water and the mist, as if this place held a piece of her, bound forever to the earth. A tremor of hesitation ran through me as I approached the edge, my boots sinking into the mud. I could see my own reflection in the still water, drawn and pale, my face shadowed in ways I didn't quite recognize. But as I looked closer, I noticed something else. Another face, faint and wavering, floating just behind my own. It was her, the woman from the locket, her expression calm and unreadable, her eyes fixed on mine. It wasn't a frightening sight. Rather, it was a reminder, a silent acknowledgement of the choice I had made to pursue this path, to uncover what lay beneath the surface. I took a slow breath, steeling myself, and reached my hand toward the water, breaking the reflection. Ripples spread outward, disrupting her face. Yet as the waves settled, I felt something shift within me. A quiet acceptance, a willingness to see this through. And then, as if summoned by my touch, the mist began to swirl, gathering itself into shapes and forms, moving with a purpose that was both graceful and menacing. Shadows began to emerge, darkening the surface of the water, creating the faint outline of figures, indistinct yet recognizable. They moved together, a gathering of specters or memories, bound to the swamp like fragments of forgotten stories. As I watched, they began to move, circling slowly, their forms twisting and blending in the mist, each figure merging into the next. And then, one by one, they turned toward me, their faces becoming clearer, their eyes hollow yet piercing, as if they could see straight into my soul. A sense of foreboding crept over me, and I felt myself instinctively step back, but the figures remained, bound to me in some way I couldn't explain. Their presence felt like a warning, yet it was laced with something deeper, an invitation, perhaps, or an expectation that I couldn't fully comprehend. The silence grew heavy around me, and I found myself speaking aloud, my voice trembling but resolute. Why am I here? The words hung in the air, barely a murmur, swallowed almost instantly by the swamp's darkness. Yet, in that moment, I felt something shift in the air, a ripple of acknowledgement that seemed to echo back to me, as if the swamp itself had heard, had understood. And then, from somewhere deep within the mist, a voice emerged, Not human, not natural, but a low, mournful hum that reverberated through the water, through the trees, through my own bones. It was a sound filled with sorrow and longing, a sound that spoke of things lost and broken, of promises shattered and dreams forgotten. It was a sound that resonated with the land, binding the past to the present in a way that felt both eternal and fleeting. The figures began to fade, their forms dissolving back into the mist, but their presence lingered, woven into the very fabric of the swamp. And as they disappeared, I felt an overwhelming sense of resolve wash over me, a quiet determination that urged me onward, deeper into the heart of this place, to uncover whatever secrets lay hidden within the shadows. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and turned away from the water, my footsteps leading me back into the dense, tangled undergrowth. The path ahead was uncertain, obscured by the darkness and the thickening mist, yet I felt a strange sense of purpose, a clarity that had been absent before. This was her story, her legacy, and I was bound to it now, for better or worse. The swamp thickened around me as I moved deeper into its heart, the air becoming a damp weight on my skin. Every step felt like wading through layers of the past, each tendril of vine or root something she had touched, each murky pool bearing her reflection. The world around me was cloaked in shadow, as if the swamp itself had been waiting for this moment, to reveal whatever it had hidden away. My path led me along an arc of twisted trees that curved like sentinels over the dark water. Their branches reached out as if to touch, to grasp. I found myself slowing, straining to hear that voice again, wondering if the silence would break with that familiar hum or if I'd stumble onto her form at any moment. But there was nothing, only a silence, so rich with anticipation that it felt like something solid, filling every gap between the trees, stretching out like an unseen net around me. And then, without warning, the air changed. A faint breeze drifted through, carrying the unmistakable sound of soft, uneven footsteps. I froze, my heart pounding as I listened, hearing them stop as I stopped. I glanced back, but there was nothing there. Only the open swamp, vast and shrouded, the mist winding its way through the trees. And yet the footsteps continued, a steady, deliberate rhythm that was both too close and too far. Swallowing my unease, I forced myself onward, though each step felt heavier than the last, each breath shallower, as if the swamp itself was growing denser, pressing in on me. The path led to a clearing, a circle of dark water fringed by reeds that seemed almost to sway in anticipation. In the center of this pool stood a single tree, gnarled and ancient, its trunk twisted as if bent under the weight of countless secrets. At the base of the tree, I saw it, a small, weathered structure, half buried in the roots and mud. It was a shrine of sorts, simple yet powerful, adorned with remnants of dried flowers and stones that had long since been swallowed by the earth. The tree's roots grew around it, embracing it like the arms of a lover, wrapping it in layers of bark and moss. Something about it felt intensely personal, as if it were a piece of her life, a relic from her world now left to decay here, forgotten by all but the swamp. I approached cautiously, feeling an inexplicable sense of reverence, as though crossing an invisible boundary. My hand reached out, almost of its own accord, brushing the worn wood. The sensation was immediate, a warmth, a pulse, as if life still lingered within, as if her essence had seeped into the very fibers of the wood. I withdrew my hand, unsettled, and yet a small voice within me urged me to stay, to look closer. And then I saw it. A small, thin object poking from the roots. A slip of paper, faded and worn but intact. My fingers trembled as I pulled it free, the parchment rough beneath my touch. Faded words sprawled across it, written in a looping, delicate script that seemed more of a whisper than a message. The words were simple, yet heavy with meaning. To the one who listens, it was as though she had left it there, not for herself, but for someone like me, someone who would wander deep enough into her world to find it. I read the words over and over, feeling their weight, as if they held the last fragments of her voice, her warning, or perhaps her plea. Suddenly, the silence around me felt oppressive, filled with things unseen. I glanced back, sensing the watchful presence of the swamp, of her, and felt a chill that reached far deeper than the skin. The sky had grown darker, the mist thickening, swirling in patterns that hinted at shapes, figures just beyond the edge of sight. It was as though the swamp itself had awakened, each leaf, each branch now straining toward me, waiting for my next move. I could feel her there, watching, the remnants of her story pressing against me from all sides. And as I stood in that clearing, clutching her message, I understood that this was no ordinary place, no simple piece of land. This was her domain, woven through with the threads of her life, her death, and something far beyond either. With her words still echoing in my mind, I carefully folded the note and slipped it into my pocket, the weight of it settling heavily against my chest. It felt like a binding, a promise, one that I was not yet sure I could keep. But I knew as I turned to leave that clearing that I was not alone. The mist seemed to thicken as I walked away from the clearing, its gray tendrils stretching out like fingers across the water. I felt her presence more intensely now, as though finding that note had shifted something in the swamp, loosening a veil that had kept her distant. The air was electric, filled with the soft sounds of water lapping against the roots of the cypress trees and the distant hum of unseen creatures. Every sense felt sharpened, attuned to her world. Yet it wasn't only her I sensed. The swamp seemed to have awakened, stirring with something primal, an awareness that I had intruded too far. Each step forward became more difficult, my legs sinking deeper into the thickening mud, my breath heavy with the damp, musky scent of decaying leaves and stagnant water. I pressed on, clutching the note in my pocket like a talisman, as if it could shield me from whatever waited ahead. Then I heard it, a faint melody carried on the wind. It was soft and mournful, like the sound of a lullaby sung to a child lost long ago. The sound drifted toward me from somewhere beyond the trees, drawing me closer despite the cold shiver that ran through my spine. I knew I should turn back, should leave this place behind, but the song called to something deep within me, something that refused to let go. I followed the melody, my heart pounding as it grew louder, closer. With each step, the swamp seemed to close in around me, the trees leaning toward one another as if to form an archway, guiding me forward. Shadows flickered at the edges of my vision, but I resisted the urge to look, to confront whatever lingered there. Instead, I focused on the music, letting it lead me deeper into the heart of the swamp. The path narrowed until it was barely a foot's width, bordered by thick reeds and hanging moss. Ahead, I saw an opening in the trees, a small clearing bathed in the faint, silvery glow of the rising moon. And in the center of that clearing stood a figure. She was as I'd imagined her, yet more vivid, more real. Her hair hung in loose waves around her shoulders, damp with the swamp's moisture, and her dress clung to her like a second skin, woven from the dark waters and tangled vines. Her face was hidden in shadow, yet I felt her gaze upon me, as sharp and unwavering as the light of a torch in the darkness. She didn't move, but the air around her pulsed with a silent energy, as though she were both there and somewhere else entirely. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us, taut and expectant. Then, with a voice soft as a breeze, she spoke my name. The sound of it filled the clearing, each syllable resonating like an echo through the trees. She knew me, knew why I'd come, and I felt a strange sense of relief, as though this was what I had been searching for all along. "I have seen your face before," I whispered, not knowing if it was true or if the swamp itself had woven her image into my memory. Her gaze remained steady, her expression unreadable. There was a sadness in her, a sorrow as ancient as the roots of the trees, as old as the swamp itself. She raised a hand, gesturing toward me, and I felt an invisible pull, a force drawing me toward her. My feet moved of their own accord, each step bringing me closer, deeper into her world. The sounds of the swamp faded, leaving only the soft, rhythmic beat of my heart and the faint hum of her voice. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice barely louder than a whisper, yet it reverberated through me, echoing in the depths of my mind. Her question was not accusatory, not hostile, but filled with a deep curiosity, as though she were trying to understand something beyond her reach. "I don't know," I replied honestly. Perhaps I wanted to know if the stories were true." At this, a faint smile crossed her lips, though it held no warmth. "The stories are only fragments," she said. "They are shadows of what once was, pieces of a truth too vast to contain." She stepped closer, her form seeming to waver like mist, and I caught a glimpse of her eyes, dark and endless, filled with a depth that defied understanding. "Tell me," she murmured, her voice soft and haunting, "do you truly seek the truth, or is it merely the thrill of the unknown that brought you here?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. There was no answer I could give that would satisfy her, no reason that would explain the strange pull that had brought me here, to this place, to her. As I stood there, grappling with the weight of her gaze, the swamp seemed to shift around us, the air thickening with an energy that vibrated in my bones. She tilted her head, watching me with a curiosity that was both childlike and ancient, as though she were seeing something in me that I could not see myself. "Be careful," she whispered, her voice barely a breath, yet it filled my mind, resonating with a power that transcended sound. "The swamp does not forgive those who tread too deeply," and with that she was gone. The clearing was empty, the air silent once more, as though she had never been there at all. I stood alone in the clearing, the faint moonlight filtering through the trees like the last remnants of a dream slipping away. The silence around me was deafening, a thick, oppressive quiet that seemed to press against my chest, making each breath more labored than the last. The figure of the woman had vanished as suddenly as she had appeared, leaving me with nothing but the echo of her warning and the hollow, aching emptiness in the pit of my stomach. I turned back the way I had come, feeling the weight of her gaze still on me, as though she were watching from the shadows, waiting for something I could not understand. The swamp stretched before me, endless and unknowable, its dark waters swirling in the distance. I was no longer certain if the path I had taken was the same one I had walked before, or if the swamp itself had changed in response to my intrusion, shifting its boundaries to trap me. With every step I took, the air seemed to grow heavier, as if the very earth beneath my feet were sinking, drawing me deeper into its grip. The whisper of the wind in the trees no longer seemed like a mere sound, but a language of its own, one that I could almost understand, though the words eluded me. The ground beneath my feet felt soft and treacherous, as though it might give way at any moment, pulling me into the dark, stagnant waters below. As I reached the edge of the swamp, I saw the distant lights of the town flickering through the trees. They were small and faint, like stars that had somehow fallen to earth, but they were a reminder of the world I had left behind. I quickened my pace, desperate to escape the suffocating grip of the swamp. Yet the further I walked, the more it seemed as though the distance between me and the town stretched further and further. When I finally emerged from the trees, I was standing on the edge of the road that led back into town. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and decay, and the night had grown unnaturally still. I glanced back at the swamp, half expecting to see her standing there, watching me from the shadows, but there was nothing. Just the dark expanse of water and trees, stretching endlessly into the distance. I could feel the weight of the swamp pressing against my mind, as though it had branded itself into my very soul. It wasn't just the woman, the curse, the warning, the oppressive atmosphere of the swamp. It was something deeper, something I couldn't shake, something that lingered long after I had left that place. As I walked away, the voice of the swamp seemed to follow me, calling softly, beckoning me to return. I didn't know if I would ever go back, but the thought haunted me, a shadow that would never leave. The legend of the woman, her curse, and the swamp itself were no longer stories to me. They were a part of me now, woven into the fabric of my being, as inescapable as the dark waters that flowed through Manchac. And though I knew the world would continue to turn, I would never be the same.